Many people believe the movie Scream was just a horror story, a masked killer stalking victims at night. But few people know that parts of that terrifying movie were inspired by a real serial killer, a man who turned a quiet college town into a nightmare in 1990. And his crimes were far more disturbing than any movie. In the summer of 1990, the quiet college town of Gainesville, Florida was preparing for a new semester. Thousands of students were arriving at the University of Florida, moving into apartments, meeting roommates, and beginning a new chapter of their lives. The city was known for its calm neighborhoods, palm-lined streets, and the constant energy of young students building their futures. Everything seemed normal, but in August of that year, something dark began to unfold. Within a few nights, Gainesville would become the center of one of the most terrifying crime stories in American history. It began during the early morning hours of August 24, 1990. Police were called to an apartment after a disturbing report from concerned individuals who had not heard from the residents. When officers arrived and entered the apartment, they immediately realized they were standing in the middle of a brutal crime scene. Inside the apartment were two young college students, Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, both just 18 years old. They had recently started their lives at the University of Florida. Friends described them as cheerful, hopeful, and excited about their future. But sometime during the night, someone had entered their apartment. The killer had waited until the residents were asleep. The attack was violent and chaotic. The crime scene shocked even experienced investigators who had seen many difficult cases before. Officers immediately understood that this was not a random act of violence. Someone had deliberately broken into the apartment and committed a calculated attack. The killer had vanished before anyone realized what had happened. News of the double murder spread quickly throughout Gainesville. Students began hearing rumors across campus, and many felt uneasy about what had happened. The city was not known for crimes like this, especially crimes so brutal. People began locking their doors more carefully. Some students called their parents to tell them about the frightening news. But what no one knew at the time was that the nightmare had only just begun. Less than 24 hours later, another disturbing discovery was made. Living alone in her apartment. The crime scene immediately raised alarm for investigators. The details were disturbingly similar to the murders from the previous night. Once again, the killer had entered the apartment during the night. Once again, the victim had been attacked while inside her home. And once again, the killer had disappeared without being seen. At this moment, investigators began to realize something terrifying. These crimes were likely connected. Someone was targeting young students. The possibility that a serial killer was operating inside the city quickly became a serious concern. Police increased patrols around Gainesville. Officers began warning students to be cautious, lock their doors, and avoid walking alone late at night. Detectives worked around the clock, trying to find witnesses or evidence that could identify the attacker. But there was a frightening problem. No one had seen anything. There were no clear suspects. The killer seemed to move through the night, like a ghost. As the investigation continued, fear began spreading across Gainesville. Parents from across the state started calling their children who attended the university. Some begged their sons and daughters to leave the city immediately. Students began changing their routines. Many refused to walk alone after dark. Some slept with lights on or stayed together in groups for safety. But despite all the warnings and increased police presence, the attacks did not stop. On August 27th, only a few days after the first murders, police made another horrifying discovery. Inside another apartment, two more victims had been killed. Their names were Manuel Taboada and Tracy Pauls. Just like the previous victims, they had been attacked during the night inside their own home. The realization was devastating. Within 4 days, 5 young people had been murdered. The entire city fell into panic. Students began packing their belongings and leaving Gainesville. Some returned home with their families, unwilling to stay in a city where a killer was still at large. Those who remained often stayed together in groups at night. Friends slept on the floors of each other's apartments because no one wanted to be alone. Gun stores reported a surge in sales as residents purchased weapons for protection. Police cars filled the streets as officers worked day and night, searching for any clue. The media quickly picked up the story. News stations from across the United States began reporting about the murders. Reporters arrived in Gainesville to cover the investigation. Soon, the unknown killer was given a name by the media. They called him the Gainesville Ripper. It was a name that would soon become known across the country. Investigators launched one of the largest criminal investigations the city had ever seen. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case. Detectives interviewed neighbors and students. They searched apartments and nearby wooded areas. They examined fingerprints and collected forensic evidence from the crime scenes. Every possible lead was investigated. But the killer seemed to have vanished. Days passed without another attack. Then weeks passed. The city slowly tried to return to normal life, but the fear never completely disappeared. Everyone had the same question. Where had the killer gone? Months later, a seemingly unrelated event occurred in another Florida city. In Ocala, Florida, police arrested a man during a robbery investigation. His name was Danny Rolling. At first, it appeared to be a routine arrest. Rolling had a long criminal history involving burglaries and robberies. He had spent much of his life moving between different cities and committing crimes. But as investigators began examining his background more closely, disturbing details started to emerge. Danny Rolling had been traveling through Florida around the same time as the Gainesville murders. He had been living in wooded areas and campsites near Gainesville, and he had a history of violent behavior. Born in 1954 in Louisiana, Rolling grew up in a troubled household. Reports later revealed that his father was extremely abusive and often violent toward him. Friends and relatives described the home environment as tense and frightening. Growing up in that environment left deep emotional scars. As he became older, Rolling began committing crimes at an early age. He struggled to maintain relationships and often lived a chaotic life that moved between criminal activity and temporary jobs. Eventually, he began drifting from place to place, living on the road and surviving through theft and robbery. By the time he was arrested in Ocala, he already had a reputation as a dangerous individual. But at that moment, investigators had not yet connected him to the Gainesville murders. That connection would come later. As detectives continued analyzing the evidence collected from the Gainesville crime scenes, they began comparing fingerprints, witness statements, and forensic data. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began pointing toward Danny Rolling. DNA evidence became a crucial breakthrough in the investigation. But the most shocking discovery came from something unexpected. While sitting in jail after his robbery arrest, Rolling began writing letters and notes. Some of these writings contained disturbing descriptions of violent crimes. When investigators examined these writings, they noticed something alarming. Rolling described details that closely matched the Gainesville murders. Details that had never been publicly released. Details that only the killer could know. Investigators carefully compared the writings with the crime scene evidence. The connection became undeniable. Danny Rolling was responsible for the Gainesville murders. Eventually, he was formally charged with killing the 5 students. The city that had lived in fear for months finally had an answer. The killer had been identified. In 1994, Danny Rolling appeared in court to face the charges against him. The courtroom was filled with journalists, investigators, and the grieving families of the victims. Everyone wanted to hear what he would say. Then something unexpected happened. Rolling confessed. He pleaded guilty to the murders. His confession confirmed what investigators had already suspected. He had entered the apartments during the night, targeting young students who were alone and vulnerable. For the families of the victims, hearing the confession brought a painful sense of closure. The court sentenced Danny Rolling to death. Even after the trial ended, Rolling continued behaving in strange ways while in prison. He wrote poems and songs, sometimes showing little emotion about the crimes he had committed. Years passed as he remained on death row. Finally, on October 25, 2006, Danny Rolling was scheduled to be executed at Florida State Prison. Witnesses gathered in the execution chamber, including reporters and family members of the victims. Just before the execution began, Rolling did something unexpected. He began singing a religious song. The quiet room filled with his voice as he sang calmly in the final moments of his life. Shortly afterward, the execution was carried out. The man known as the Gainesville Ripper was gone. But the story of what happened in Gainesville during the summer of 1990 would never be forgotten. For many students who lived in the city at that time, Those days left a lasting memory of fear. They remembered locking their doors and windows. They remembered empty streets at night and the constant presence of police patrols. The case became one of the most well-known serial killer investigations in American history. It even influenced elements of popular horror stories and films in the years that followed. But behind the headlines and media coverage were real victims. 5 young people who had their futures taken away. 5 families whose lives were forever changed. And a city that would never forget the summer when fear spread through its streets. Sometimes the most disturbing stories are not the ones created for movies. They are the ones that truly happened. Stories where ordinary places suddenly become scenes of horror. Stories where danger hides in places people believe are safe. In Gainesville, during the summer of 1990, a quiet college town learned just how fragile safety can be. Because for 4 nights, while the city slept, a killer moved silently through the darkness, and no one knew who he was, until it was too late.